This is Wabi-sabi Podcast, and I am your host, Adam Yasmin. Thanks so much for being here, for listening, for engaging in the content, for your feedback, and for subscribing. I definitely welcome all the feedback through all the channels, as I think that authentic engagement is more important than mindless subscribing. So please take a moment, whenever you have a moment, to connect. You could do so on my website at adamyasmin.com or through Instagram at adamyasmin. Just want to take this moment to remind people of the importance of building resilience in the face of everything that we're dealing with, especially here in the States, as we're venturing into uncharted territory with this now contested election. And I mean that wholeheartedly, and I invite people to reach out and connect also on the basis of digital well-being, as I am in the process of pursuing a certificate with the Digital Wellness Institute, and will be partnering with the Associated Collective to offer services to everyone, whether it's individuals, families, or groups, to support people and help them find their optimal state of mental and physical well-being as we relate to our daily tech usage. And I'm also excited to introduce this week's guest, Teodora Pavkovic, who is a member of the Digital Wellness Collective. Without further ado, here's Teodora. Yeah, I'd say just for posterity's sake, if you could introduce yourself to the audience and a little bit of background on what you do or what you do in the world.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Teodora Pavkovic. I'm a psychotherapist, a parenting coach, and an international speaker. And my background is primarily in psychology. And through my bachelor's degree training, my graduate school training in psychology, I've just come to be even more curious about human beings than I was before I embarked on that journey. I knew very early on that I wanted to be a psychotherapist, and that I wanted to, as I call it, be a professional brain picker. And I thoroughly enjoy that today, as I did 20 years ago, which is when I started my bachelor's degree. Actually, it's hard to believe it's been 20 years, but my background's in psychology, and I've trained a lot in different modalities of psychotherapy. So talking therapies are really my expertise, and I've trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, hypnotherapy, solution-focused brief therapy, and some coaching approaches. And so a lot of what I do right now is working with both parents and children individually, but also delivering workshops, trainings, talks on topics around emotional intelligence, mental health, positive psychology, and then digital wellness, which is one of the kind of the more recent additions, I guess, to my toolkit, but it's also a more recent kind of area of interest for me. It wasn't something that I kind of started off in this field being interested in because it wasn't really around. I started studying psychology in 2000. We weren't talking about tech in the same way that we are now. And just earlier today, actually, I was speaking with a few colleagues who are parenting coaches as well, saying that none of us were really trained in that kind of true sense of the word, whether it's, academically or otherwise, to help parents and kids with their technology use. But hopefully what we're trying to do through this work is use the knowledge that we have from our backgrounds, which are really varied. Many of us come from a psychology background like myself. Some of us are educators, others are kind of true parent coaches. There are some people who were, in the marketing field and then decided to almost kind of go to the other side, if that's the way we can kind of qualify that and describe it, to help both adults and kids try and make sense of this role that technology plays in our life and the impact that it has on our mental health, on the way we relate to ourselves, on our friendships, something that's more recently become very important in the US, how we consume information, how we make decisions, on a daily basis around everything from who we're going to be friends with to, what product we're going to buy, who we're going to vote for, and just so many other things. So that's kind of my current area of interest, but I really come to that field of digital wellness from this background in psychology and emotional intelligence and positive psychology, and really try to use the principles from those fields in order to help people kind of make sense of themselves as digital citizens, which we all are right now.
Given the breadth of not only your experiences that led you to today, but also with what you are doing, the scope of what you're doing today, I would imagine that you're quite busy, given the spectrum of what we are dealing with today.
Mm. Yeah, true. There's there's a lot of stuff going on, which I guess we still, or I know that I sometimes still think of it in as someone who was born in the 80s, which I am, which is, this is just happening in America, or this is just happening in Cambodia or in, Nigeria, whichever country, why there's that initial question of why do they care about this in, whatever part of the world. But because of technology and because of globalization and because of the way technology works and marketing works and all these apps and platforms that we're on, people across the world are impacted by something that happens, say, in America or in Cambodia or in Nigeria. And we all feel it, for better or for worse. Sometimes when it's the spread of good, positive, uplifting, nourishing, nurturing information or events that happen, it's a wonderful thing. But of course, we can't really pick and choose. And so when it's negative things, they really do impact everybody. And it's very difficult to, whoever I've spoken to over the past few days, to not have a conversation around, for example, the US election. So it doesn't matter who I spoke to, whether it was my family who are in Serbia or friends I have who are in Singapore, or, obviously people in different parts of the US, everybody's talking about that. And I think it's just an interesting testament to what technology has become and how wide of an impact it has. So for those of us who are professional brain pickers and who are concerned with people's health and well-being, I think it's a challenge for us as well to, you said breadth, to expand that even more and to take into our awareness even more information, and to really be open, I think, with every person we speak to, and not assume that we know what impacts them or what affects them or what worries them, to really kind of let them tell us what that is and why it is that they're so moved by that.
Yeah, wow. As you were mentioning that, suddenly this, not this particular image, but this concept of, tech as it spreads across the globe. I wonder if in a way it leads to this kind of homogenization of culture or of pop culture, or like we are, today is Friday, November 6th. We still are, have a contested presidential election. And as you, I was talking to a relative in Israel the other day, and yeah, it's kind of the only thing anyone can or will or is willing to talk about right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you speak?
no,
Could you speak to that?
absolutely. Sure, absolutely. There are a few things that kind of came up for me as you were saying that. One is that I recently traveled to Serbia, and one of the things that I've noticed, obviously, the kids there are also using TikTok, and they're using Instagram, and they're using YouTube, and the phenomenon of the influencer also very much exists there. And we've always had global trends. I mean, that's always been the case, whether it's fashion or whatever it might be. But I noticed it in a very different way this time, in a way in which I've not quite seen the embodiment of such a trend now as I did before, where I was seeing a lot of these young girls, kind of age range, I don't know, maybe 13 to say 18 or 19, who look exactly the same as some of the girls that I'll see here in New York City, or that I'll kind of, again, virtually see in other parts of the US, like say California, or wherever they might be situated. And it really, it wasn't even just a trend, it really was a copy paste type situation, where the clothes they were wearing were the same, the way they were doing their hair, the way they were doing their makeup. And I was really, again, being a psychologist, I tend to take things apart into their finer detail. And I was really shocked by the similarity in how they looked, where it wasn't just about, I've taken on a trend and I'm incorporating it into who I am. It's, I am becoming that kind of person, or not even a person, it's an identity, really.
Yeah.
So, and I think that does speak to that, kind of homogenous existence that we take on, whether it's the narrative we have around US elections, or the latest makeup trends, or whatever it is. And I don't know if we can kind of blame technology on that, but the fact that technology exists in the form that it does makes that possible. So that if you're a girl somewhere in Eastern Europe, you can really, down to the T, copy the makeup trends of the girls, say, in the US. On the other hand, though, another thing that I thought about in terms of this idea of globalization and of the spreading of trends, I was looking at the calendar earlier today to schedule something for next week, and I realized that Friday the 13th is coming up next week. And Friday the 13th is, or rather the fear of Friday the 13th, is something that spread throughout the world long before we had technology in this form, right? And long before we had Instagram, and long before we could create memes around Friday the 13th. We're talking about the Middle Ages in Europe. And something that happened, I don't want to geek out on people too much, but an event that was very specific to one, population, the Templars in Europe, that then spread and became this, Friday the 13th. And a lot of the time, people who are very superstitious and again, afraid of Friday the 13th, I'll ask them, do you know where that comes from? And they won't know. They won't actually know what the origin of the story is. And yet it's something that's spread globally. So I think, to a certain extent, it's just human nature, and it's just the way, it's the way we communicate and the way we interact with each other. It's the way our brain works. It's the psychological basis of superstition and communication, all these different things. But again, the fact that that technology exists in the form that it does right now makes it really easy, that much easier for these sorts of things to spread. And kind of one of its maybe negative aspects is that I think it leads to this very homogenous, I don't know, just again, taking up of identities, which takes away so much individuality and so much, I like to call it the kind of beautiful messiness of what it means to be human and to be living in different parts of the world.
Yeah. Got to digest that for a moment. Because I really appreciate that at the very beginning of this, you mentioned that you are a brain picker and you like to take things apart to understand them. Assuming that as I hear that, you're telling me that you're a visual learner.
Definitely, yeah.
And I can relate to that in my own subjective way, and which is kind of what led me also into not just into UX as a field before I'm now abandoning ship from UX
Mm,
as a whole. Right now, it seems yeah, it is rife with unethical
mm,
practice, and we
mm,
don't really need to get into that at this moment. The reason why I'm
mm,
bringing it up is because um, the the growing prevalence of digital wellness as a field that touches on
mm,
education, psychology,
mm,
um, sort of the health and wellness fields,
mm,
um, how it affects, yeah, conversation,
mm,
connection,
mm,
et cetera, et
mm,
cetera. And
mm,
um, I am curious to know from a parenting coach perspective, what does the field look like to you, being based in New York? Are your so I'm assuming
mm,
because of your psychology background,
mm.
and I'm assuming licensing, you could really only
Mm.
speak with or work with clients in New York State. Is that correct?
So actually, it's exactly the opposite.
Okay.
Because I've lived in a lot of different places. So I'm a third culture kid, which is a slightly different um, aspect of the story, I guess. But because I've lived in a lot of different places, I continue to have clients in a lot of different places, and that's because I practice as a coach. Definitely while I'm here in the US, because I'm not licensed here as a mental health practitioner.
Right.
So, kind of the benefit of that is that I'm able to speak to people who are in a lot of different places. So, both who are here in New York, some people who are back in Serbia, where I'm originally from, people in the UK, people in Singapore. So in those terms, it provides me with that kind of global perspective on parenting, but on so many other things as well.
Mm-hmm. Um, how did you? So when did you get into coaching? Sort of given the spectrum of your background. So
Mm.
where does coaching come in?
Sure. So that's the most kind of, again, similar to digital wellness. It's the most kind of recent addition
Mm-hmm.
to what I do. I was primarily focused on psychotherapy, primarily on kind of CBT based psychotherapy with some elements of mindfulness and hypnotherapy. And for the most part, I was doing that therapy in a kind of classical one-on-one setting with either younger adults or older adults. And then, kind of on the side of that, I was also working with children. I've worked with kids, with young kids in educational settings, so kind of kindergarten age kids, and then also doing kind of workshops more. I wouldn't call them therapy workshops, but kind of mindfulness and EQ based workshops, again, for younger kids. Kind of the kindergarten age is my sweet spot. That's
Mm-hmm.
my favorite group of kiddos. So I've worked a lot with them, teaching them mindfulness practices, emotional intelligence, body awareness, positive psychology practices they can use, and things like that. And so it was kind of during my transition from Singapore, which is where I lived before I moved to New York, during that transitional period of moving to here, where part of it was just for the practical reasons of not knowing quite how long I would be in New York, and discovering that the licensing process is pretty arduous and time consuming and complicated, and all the rest of it. But I still wanted to do what I've always wanted to do, and be able to do that here. And so part of that kind of transition into coaching was for that reason. But then the kind of the digital wellness coaching came from some of the early observations I had in Singapore of how technology was starting to be taken up by families and to be used by their very, very young children. So again, because I've mostly worked with younger kids, I'm always observing them kind of in the wild, and seeing what they're doing and what they're up to and how they interact with their parents. And what I started noticing in kind of late 2015, early 2016 was that I was increasingly seeing kids on devices in settings in which they normally wouldn't have a device, or there wouldn't really be a reason or a purpose for that device. So on the bus, for example, while a child is just kind of looking out the window, mindfully observing what's going on without them around them, or wondering what's going on in nature, and whatever else happens in their little brains. Or settings where they would be having some food with their parents, being out in the park with their parents, being in a stroller. It was just settings in which you normally wouldn't kind of, I think of it as limiting the child's outlook in a sense.
Yeah.
Because what we see with kids oftentimes is that it's during those times in particular when they're either in a stroller or they're looking out the window where their brain can really kind of do what it does best, which is just kind of wonder and daydream and ask a lot of questions about what is going on in the world. Or it can go the other way too, and they can become incredibly bored,
Mm-hmm.
which is wonderful because, well, it's wonderful as long as you let them fix that problem.
Right.
And that's
Right.
often what we see, is that problem is being fixed with the device. And so that was when I started to ask just myself, to begin with, questions around, okay, what does this mean if you essentially, the way I conceptualize it, insert a device between the parent and the child in those moments where either the child would be left kind of to their own devices for their own brain to do what it does, or in the instances where the parent and child would have that opportunity to connect over something. What happens if you insert a device into that situation? And if we think in terms of developmentally what children need to grow up the way they need to grow up ideally, if there's this connection to that device starting from a very early age, what can we potentially hypothesize might be the problems, or might be the issues, might be the challenges? And so that was when I started to focus on that topic of digital wellness. And then moving into New York, it became kind of the focus of my work. So doing digital wellness coaching, whether it's individually, I do a lot of workshops as well. So workshops, talks in different settings. So whether it's a school setting, corporates, and then kind of more recently also having different companies, like marketing companies, for example, that create products for children, reaching out to me, asking questions around, are we doing this the right way, and is this developmentally appropriate? Or people who are creating apps or platforms for kids, reaching out and saying, we really want the psychological perspective, not the usual psychological perspective, which is around persuasive tech and all these things, that persuasive design that we're familiar with, but really thinking in terms of what is developmentally appropriate, and what are children like when they're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and how do we make sure that we don't overstep whether it's ethical boundaries or other types of boundaries in terms of how we create product for them. So that's really my mission, you could say, or my goal, my aim, my hope when it comes to this digital wellness work that I do, that is still not really kind of mainstream. I think, a lot of organizations like Digital Wellness Collective, which we're a part of, are doing amazing work to really get the word out on this, and to really kind of establish digital wellness as a kind of legit part of well-being, and one that we really need to pay a lot more attention to. So I'm hopeful for the future. I'm seeing an increase in interest in this topic, whether it's from corporates, from parents, from schools. And I hope that interest will only grow, because it's incredibly important. And I think those of us who are in the psychology field really understand just how subtle that impact can be, especially when you're talking about younger kids. And for me, really, my main wish is for parents to just be aware of that, to know what the potential kind of challenges can be there, what the potential, I don't want to say damages can be, because I don't necessarily, unless you're talking about very severe overuse of tech, there's no damage that can't be repaired. So it's
Right.
not like, oh God, I ruined my child because I let them use,
Yeah.
the iPad when they were 2. It's absolutely not that.
Yeah.
But it can create subtle differences in terms of their ability to pay attention, to stay focused, to be able to emotionally regulate, to be able to maintain eye contact, a lot of different things like that. So so that's kind of my goal with my own practice when it comes to digital wellness coaching, to really educate and raise awareness, first of all, and then to help people establish a much healthier relationship with tech.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. It made me think about, so myself as a parent to a 5-year-old, to a official
Yeah.
official virtual kindergartner.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to pick your brain on this age range in
Yeah.
particular, just at least not selfishly for myself, but
Sure.
also just for people
Sure.
who I know in my community who have 4 and 5-year-old kids.
Mm.
Um, and before we get into that, I just wanted to comment on your observation, and I was
Mm.
sharing those observations just before I became a parent when I was working back in 2014. I
Mm-hmm.
was working with this really popular coconut water company where I was like a brand ambassador, and I was doing demo. I was that guy at Whole Foods demoing coconut water. What an amazingly also terrifying sort of anthropological spelunking
Right.
um, experience where all I saw left and right
Mm.
were 2, 3, and 4-year olds with
Mm.
10-inch iPad,
Mm.
not a mini, not even a phone,
Right. The full
10-inch
size.
full
Mm-hmm.
size iPads in the stroller like this,
Mm-hmm.
and the parents
Mm.
just not giving an F.
Mm.
Um, and it really struck me,
Yeah.
um, and quite literally, because at the end of that year, my partner and I found out we were pregnant,
Right.
and um, and that's what's so interesting about it. It's
Mm.
not that I thought to myself, "Oh, this person is damaging their child." It's more of
Right.
this immediate social. It's like this double-edged paradox
Mm-hmm.
of a social stigma.
Mm-hmm.
There's a parent who possibly, without knowing yet, but possibly
Mm.
understandably doesn't want their child to act out in a supermarket,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
But also you lose the connection
Yeah.
with your child to look at things, or to look at objects, or to notice people, or to notice whatever
Absolutely.
in a supermarket.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and maybe and today,
Mm.
or I guess just before the pandemic, when we can go to playgrounds, because playgrounds were closed for
Yeah.
the better part of 8 months. I mean,
Mm.
just being with my, at the time, 4-year-old,
Mm.
we would go to the playground, and as soon as kids can leap into being immersed in a playground, a parent
Right.
will whip out their phone,
Yeah. Yeah.
and who knows? Are
Yeah.
you distracting yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Are you are you having your own pacifier, so to speak? It is this double-edged sword. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. If I could ask you a quick question though,
Please, yeah, yeah.
did you ever find yourself giving your child the device while they were in a stroller and in a similar situation?
So we only have one. We have one sort of, it's not even a rule. It's like there's a free for all sort of code of conduct that we have in our family, which is when we're
Mm-hmm.
in transit, we will save some movies. Like if we're flying, like we fly in a world that no longer exists now. What
Yeah.
pre-pandemic, we would fly once a year to London to go
Okay.
visit family,
Mm-hmm.
and so we would, pack the movies if there
Mm-hmm.
weren't movies on the airplane,
Sure.
interface.
Mm-hmm.
So like when we're flying or when we're on road trips,
Mm-hmm.
it's there and it's accessible, and it's
Right.
accessible based on what what we provide
Sure.
in terms of content.
Sure.
Um, Otherwise, we are we are as present in the world as we
Sure.
can be. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
that's a conscious choice, and it's not
Sure.
easy. Sometimes I wish
Sure.
I could just,
Mm,
please take my phone and occupy yourself for 20 minutes.
yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
I want that sometimes too, but I
Sure.
don't want to rely on that. And so
Mm-hmm.
it is a kind of a reinforcing,
Sure.
um,
It's
it's
a
part of a
conscious
belief. It's
decision.
a conscious decision. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just asked because um, obviously as a psychologist, I have my reactions to,
Hmm.
when I see that as well. And, I mean, it is a judgment in a sense. I think I like to defend my right to judge, based on the fact that I'm coming at it from that more, the academic psychological kind of, what is best and what is healthiest. Although I also withhold my judgment because that may be the one time over the past 2 weeks that the parent
Right.
had. So it's a very nuanced kind of thing. But the reason why I ask is because oftentimes you'll hear from parents that, oh, I used to look down upon those parents. I said, I'll never become that parent. And then, and then you have your own kid and you find that, oh gosh, okay, this is harder than I thought it was going to be. And then parents will sometimes find themselves reaching for those devices. Some people call them digital pacifiers, and they use them, for that purpose. And so I just wanted to make sure that we kind of voice that as well, because I'm sure there may
Sure.
be some parents who are listening to us going, oh, crap, I do that too. I
Yeah.
give that to my kids. So
Yeah.
it's, lots of parents do. And like you said, it's a very difficult choice. So I think it's important to have understanding for that. But I'm also glad to hear you sharing about the fact that it's been a very deliberate, very conscious, very intentional choice on your part to set up certain rules around that. This is how we interact when we're together, and this is what we prioritize. We prioritize that direct human to human connection, even though of course we have tech available and we can use it if we need to, but we don't want to rely on it as a kind of crutch. And
Yeah.
so I think that's one of the most important guiding principles that I always share with parents in general, is to really try and aim for that as much as you possibly can, to not rely on the digital pacifier, to not try and use it as a crutch, because kids also, especially when we're talking about young kids, they learn very quickly,
Yeah.
which a lot of parents will see. You got 1-year olds who know how to swipe the screen, but and there's been videos, I think on YouTube or something, of 1-year olds not knowing how to use a magazine. They keep swiping the front, the front page, thinking it's going to swipe.
Holy shit. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
And again, for me as a psychologist, I'm horrified when I see that, but a lot
Yeah.
of parents will go, oh my God, isn't this amazing? Look, my kid knows how to swipe. So we know that kids learn very, very quickly. The problem is that they get used to things also very
Yeah.
quickly. And that's just down to the brain. That's how the brain copes. It learns very quickly because kids are born into this world not knowing what the rules are, and they'll just
Yeah.
absorb everything around them as a sponge. So,
Yeah.
oftentimes what I see, and I know a lot of other people who are in this field who have maybe a psychiatry, background, psychology backgrounds as well, have noticed that young kids who are who tend to use tech a lot as a digital pacifier also tend to be the most irritable. And so then you find yourself in this loop where your child is very irritable, and then you use the tech to try and pacify them. And then it works for a tiny bit of time, but then it really doesn't. And then they get even more irritable, and it keeps going around and around. And just recently, again, when I was on my way back from Serbia during that flight, there was one child I think she was about 2 or 3 years old, um, very irritable during the flight. You could just tell that she couldn't find a comfortable spot. And she was very cranky, and she was kind of crying, but it wasn't that hysterical, loud crying. It was that much more subtle, just kind of, I'm so frustrated, I don't know what to do with myself type of crying. And once we landed, I saw her and her mom again. And as soon as they landed, the girl was on a phone watching videos. And I remembered that literally up until the second when we walked into the plane, she was doing the same thing. because I had seen them. And that's not to say that every child who watches videos on a smartphone will be like that, but I wasn't surprised
Yeah.
that she was that level of irritable for a pretty long time. It was about a 10-hour flight, and for
Yeah.
most of that time, she really, you could just see she was uncomfortable in her own skin. She couldn't figure out how to kind of soothe and calm down. So that's another really important thing for parents to look out for, because it does become a loop very, very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially like I can only imagine at this stage of like year 800 in this pandemic,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
as a coping strategy for
Mm.
parents
Yeah.
who just need
Mm.
baseline survival.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
like what
Mm.
that's that, yeah, just I mean, really, out of curiosity,
Mm.
as a parenting coach, like
Mm.
how have parents been approaching you in this atmosphere, saying, please help me,
Mm.
um, fine tune this, or change it
Yeah.
so that it's perceivably better. I mean, like what do you tell folks?
Yeah. There's been, I mean, across the board, there's been a lot of overwhelm, regardless of where these people are based. So again, like I was saying, I'm lucky enough to get that global perspective. So I talk to people who live in a lot of different places, and the overwhelm, I think, is the commonality. It's the same for everyone, whether they are able to work from home or aren't, whether they do have a job or they don't, whether they are struggling financially or they're not. It's just it's a common thing. There's general overwhelm. And because they know when they reach out to me that obviously digital wellness is one of the things that I focus on, they do have that level of awareness of there are probably better and worse ways in which we can use our technology, which is always great because it makes my job that much easier, because then we can kind of go straight into those conversations. One of the other things that have been coming up, that has been coming up a lot, again, across the board, and I've read this in different articles and seen it in the news and things, that a lot of parents are reporting that their kids have become incredibly clingy and incredibly kind of dependent on them. And the parents' first reaction is, oh, what's going on? What's wrong? What's happening? Why are you like that? And I've been trying to just kind of reassure parents that this is actually a really positive, really wonderful, really beautiful thing. On the one hand, part of it is that they're afraid. They're very much aware of what's going on around us. We often underestimate how much kids are aware of what's happening. So part of it is because of a sense of fear and a sense of insecurity. But on the other hand, really all it is, and this is especially for parents who work, whether it's part-time or full-time, who've been working outside of the home, your kids finally get to see you. They get to see you at times of the day when they're not used to seeing you. And inside they're thinking, yes, finally, I've got them. They're right here. And so they latch on and they don't want to let you go. So that, there's nothing wrong with that. It's definitely a positive thing. And I try to kind of help parents sort of ease into that, because their first reaction, because it's strange for them too. It's kind of sad, but a lot of parents are not used to seeing their kids for extended periods of time during the day, especially if they work full time, and if they're used to working outside of the home, they'll maybe see them for a couple of hours, maybe 3 hours a day tops. So part of what I've tried to do, and to encourage parents to do as much as possible, is to really take advantage of that clinginess, which at first seems really annoying or alarming or whatever it is, and to use that kind of, it's a kind of a call that your child is making. It's an invitation that they're making to you, that they want to spend time with you, and they're scared and they need your presence. Again, you were talking about presence before. They need your reassurance. So really kind of use that as much as you possibly can. Really kind of lean into it. Don't try to fight it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a negative thing. It's very much positive. And so that's been one aspect of it. One of the things that I've been saying to parents when it comes to tech use, I definitely don't have the attitude of let's just try and slash screen time as much as we possibly can, because it's a lot more nuanced than that. A lot of the times I find that parents actually have a certain idea of what they want to do even before we start. So sometimes they'll want to go completely tech free and they just need a little bit of support with that. Sometimes they want to go kind of tech minimal. Other times they don't want to, and they just kind of they just want to establish some rules around how technology is being used in the home. And then my role really is, as a coach, really to coach them through that, and to help them to kind of test things out and see what works and see what doesn't work, and then adapt. But one of the most important things I always try to impart on them is that there are better and worse ways of using tech. Another important thing is that if you have more than one child, it's very unlikely that exactly the same kind of rules will apply to both. And that's something that comes up as well. And that's something that parents can struggle with sometimes, because they will say, well, I have a 16 and a 12 and a 7-year-old, and the 7-year-old wants to do what the 16-year-old is doing, or, whatever it is. And then it's really looking at the kind of natural occurring differences that happen in your kids anyway. One child maybe knows that they need to stay away from sugar because it doesn't have a great impact on their energy. Another one, may be intolerant to gluten or something like that. And so they're the kid who doesn't have gluten while the other two have gluten. And so it's really finding examples within your life that are there already, that exist. And just saying, much in the same way that we regulate, how the three of you eat, or how you do whatever else it is, the color of shirts you like to wear, we're going to do the same thing with tech, because it obviously has a different impact on the 16-year-old as compared to the 7-year-old, as compared to the 8-year-old. And I think for families who have that age range within the family, I think for us as coaches, as psychologists, we really appreciate the way tech plays out in their family, because it just shows you how you can't use the term screen time and just say you should have more or less of it, because different kids have a different affinity towards different types of technology and devices, both hardware and software, and it'll have different impacts on them depending on what they're like anyway, just as depending on their temperament and personality. So there's a little bit of that as well. When it's a family with more than one child, it's really looking at the two or more kids and looking at, okay, how does tech impact them both? How do they like to use technology? What are the ways in which they like to use it? And maybe it's not so bad that they spend, I don't know, an hour on Fortnite, for example. Like, maybe it's okay. Maybe it's not no cause for alarm until you see maybe certain warning signs. Then maybe we have to go back and we have to talk about it a little bit. But maybe it's not such a bad thing. Maybe they're all right, but your other child maybe is not doing okay spending that 1 hour on Fortnite. And so then maybe we need to change that up a little bit. So so it is a nuanced approach. I try to encourage, I think we all should, as much as we can, try to connect with each other as directly as we can right now. We really need that. We need that desperately. And there was a really great article, I think in the New York Times a few months ago, that said that we're all becoming really socially awkward because we're not used to directly communicating with each other anymore. So even as adults, we're struggling with this a little bit. Kids are having a really difficult time. But again, the kind of third and final thing, that's the most important thing that I remind parents of, is that kids are incredibly resilient, and kids can go through adversity and they can bounce back and they'll come back, and oftentimes they'll do it better than we can. And so I also always encourage parents to talk to their kids, especially when it comes to tech use. Over the past few months, I've been involved in a few different kind of summits and projects where youth have really led the conversations around tech use. And, kids even as young as 6 and 7 who use different types of technology are aware of the fact that there is such a thing as too much tech, and there is such a thing as it stops being enjoyable after a while and it gets stressful and it gives me a headache or it gives me a backache or whatever it is. And some of them come up with their own ways of regulating their tech use. Not all, but some of them do. So that's also something that I always encourage parents to do, to really have that conversation with their kids. One of the main reasons being that, we need to be role models for them. And let's be honest, we're not the best role models when it comes to tech use. Many of us have our own issues. And, you know, and I always say this, whether you're a parent or not, I encourage everybody to be mindful when they're around children, your children or other people's children, when it comes to how you use technology. And so that was a rule while I was using the subway in New York, which I no longer do. But I kind of just made a rule for myself that if I ever, you know, hop on the subway and there's a small child there, I won't use my phone or whatever my tech is while that child is there, because there were so many instances when I saw the child, you know, sitting on one side of the car on their parent's lap, looking up across the car, and everybody's face is buried in their tech, and that child is just not able to make eye contact, not able to smile or make noises or, you know, just connect with that other person. And that just made me incredibly sad. And I thought, okay, I know better, so I can act better. So anytime I'd get in a car and there was a child there, I would always put my phone away. I'd look at the child, make eye contact, smile at them, sometimes chat with them, depending on how chatty they were, and just have that connection with them, so that they have a sense of, you know, there was at least one grown up today who paid attention to me and who actually noticed that I'm alive, you know, and that I'm there, and that I'm a person. So yeah, I feel it's really a collective responsibility, whether you are a parent or not. I feel we're all responsible for how children grow up and how they develop. And it's I know it's a shabby term at this point, but it does take a village. It takes the whole planet, I think, at this point.
Wow. Yeah, I'm in total agreement. I mean, personally, like just from my own subjective experience in the world, as a person, but also as a parent.
Right.
I mean, as you're saying that, you immediately brought me back to some of my favorite experiences in the world are like riding the metro or the tube with her, and experiencing people, and like, you know, and different cities obviously are gonna, like, I think maybe more people on the metro were sucked into devices, less so on the tube.
Right.
It's not a judgment, but like, it's just something I observed,
right.
you know, in those cumulative experiences. There's so much more to like tease out in this particular subject. But the one thing I would like to add, is, as one of the strategies that we use, you know, here at home, like if there's going to be, let's say, meal prep, and, you know, letting her watch a program or something new that she could watch while we're in the kitchen together.
Right.
Something that I consciously am always doing is keeping the conversation going, even though we may not be eye to eye, but just like, hey, so tell me the story. What's going on in this show? Who are the characters? What are they dealing with? Just to keep some level of engagement going, so it isn't just full detachment.
Absolutely. And that's a wonderful example of the role that technology can absolutely play in all of our homes and all of our families, and ways in which it can just provide an opportunity, like you said, to still stay connected. And there's one example. I mean, there's quite a few, but there's one example that I really like to share in terms of what that looked like in my home. And I also always, especially if I'm talking to kids, when I'm talking to parents as well, I don't want to be a hypocrite. And so I always say that, you know, I was born in the 80s. I spent a lot of time watching television, you know, when I was a kid. So there's no denying that. When I was about, I don't know, I was a couple of years old, probably, or 2 or 3 or something like that, we'd have those instances where my mom and I, when my dad was at work, we'd be home alone in the apartment. And I was obsessed with Wizard of Oz. I mean, obsessed to the point where my nickname to this day, or one of the nicknames that my dad has for me, is Dorothy, because I was obsessed with just everything to do with the Wizard of Oz. And so one of the things that my mom and I would do was, when she would go into the kitchen to start prepping the food, we'd put, I think Wizard of Oz was on all day long, every day anyway. It was just kind of always there. So we'd put Wizard of Oz on. The TV was in the living room. We would both go into the kitchen, and I would pull out a drawer and pretend that I was Dorothy walking around the pigsty, and then I would like fall in and I would fall back out and stuff like that. So that was an example of how technology was very much present. And it was television. It was a film that lasts longer than the 20 minutes that, according to, the American Pediatric Association or whoever, I was probably supposed to spend at that point. But I also wasn't glued to it in that sense. So it was a moment for, on the one hand, for my mom and I to connect and she'd probably call me Dorothy, and we'd get into a whole little probably, interaction and little role play. But it was also an opportunity for me to kind of play and to stimulate my imagination and to role play and to develop the foundational aspects of empathy that every child develops in a similar way, which is putting yourself literally in another person's shoes. And that's literally what I was doing. I was impersonating Dorothy, and I was kind of experiencing what that must have been like for her to, in that instance, fall into the pigsty and so on. So that's one example that yours reminded me of, that I always like to share, because one of the other things that I'm a huge proponent of is always, not always, as much as you can, to co-view and to co-share tech. So especially when kids are very young. And there's been, a number of studies that have been carried out that show that when it comes to children's ability to comprehend storylines, their vocabulary, while they're using tech, it's much, much better if there's an adult there to ask the kinds of questions that you brought up. So asking questions about the characters and their motivation and their emotional state and what they were thinking and all these different things. So having that adult there to kind of have that back and forth and to again kind of tickle their brain a little bit and get them thinking about certain things is really, really valuable. So when it comes again to that younger kind of age group, I think tech can play or not even tech, I don't like to call it, whatever is in that tech. So if it's a cartoon, if it's a storyline, an audiobook, whatever it is, it can play a wonderful role in that family in times when you're getting ready for bed or you're prepping dinner or you're having a shower, doesn't matter, whatever it is. Movies and books, music as well was another really, really huge one for me. Some of my kind of most vivid memories are of music that, well, to begin with, my dad played on a record player. And then later on, we got a little bit more advanced with our tech, but it was still tech, and it still had a role in our home, but it was through the music. And so then we spent countless hours, dancing together and singing together and talking about the music and about these different musicians. And again, they were coming from all over the world. And I remember, again, one of the most vivid memories I have when I was very little was of this Eurythmics album cover where she had very short hair. And then, is his name John Stewart? I always forget his name. But anyway, he had very long hair. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, she's a girl and she looks like a boy, and he's a boy and he looks like a girl. And then my dad would talk to me, and then we, so it's all those conversations that you have with your kids that, it doesn't just have to be, for the people who are very tech extreme in the sense of like no tech, like there can't be any tech in the home at all. All of the conversation and the development and everything just has to kind of come from within you. It doesn't always. It's great when it does, but there's also so much just wonderful stuff out there in the world, and it usually comes from the arts. Whether it's theater or music or film or books, that can be wonderful conversation starters, and that can be a wonderful way to teach your child about the world that they're about to kind of step out into once they're a little bit older. So yeah, I think there are great ways of using tech to initiate, those kinds of interactions.
Absolutely. Wow. It feels almost like a strange juxtaposition to go into a different topic at this point. Again, because there's just so much to just to touch on, in terms of parenting in a pandemic in 2020.
Yeah.
I almost feel like it would be way too cliche to even talk about just this week, the significance of this week, and just how you feel and what you're
Yeah.
thinking, and or maybe what
Yeah.
you're talking to, or your clients talking to you about, or asking you questions about, how
Mm,
do I deal with, you know, XYZ, or maybe sort of stress and
right.
anxiety as it pertains to the significance of this week.
Right. Right. Yeah. For me, it's been an interesting experience because, and I've been saying that for the past few weeks, and that's maybe why also the people who I'm working with professionally aren't necessarily bringing that up as a, it's not something they're necessarily asking me questions around specifically. It's more questions around kind of stress and coping and things like that. But I'm living in the US, so I'm looking at this kind of from the inside out, but I'm very much an outsider because I'm not a citizen, and so I can't vote here, and so I have no impact on what happens kind of, either way when it comes to this election. But I think one of the most interesting aspects of it has been what I'd mentioned before, in the sense that it feels like it's a global election. It doesn't feel like it's localized to this particular continent. It's kind of spread out everywhere. And partly due to again tech, as we were saying before, and partly to do with a lot, I think it's just a kind of confluence of a lot of different things. But it's just been interesting for me again to observe what has been going on. And I think for me personally, it's been a little bit of a defense mechanism as well, right? Because when you're an observer, you're not really involved, you're not in it. It doesn't really move you and impact you and affect you as strongly as when you're an experiencer. This is more of kind of that observational aspect of it. So I think that kind of global, the global quality of what has been going on, has been very interesting. It's also been interesting to see what the ways in which people have and haven't been able to cope with what's going on. And so a lot of people have been saying, I've been doom scrolling like crazy this week, which is, one of those terms that we use in digital wellness, that basically talks about, going through the news up until it really starts to feel very bad. It almost feels like you're self-harming, by doom scrolling. So a lot of people have been saying that, that they've been doing that. A lot of people have just been kind of refresh. And actually I saw a very sweet, I think it was on IG, somebody posted saying that their friend's 3-year-old asked, when is mommy going to stop watching that show about maps? Because, maps are the
Right.
only thing
The
that we
only thing we're
have
looking at.
on our screens. Exactly. So this little 3-year-old is wondering, when is this show about maps going to stop? So
Actually,
so yeah, so that's been very interesting. And then for me personally, it's been interesting because it's been bringing up a lot of, it's just been a kind of reflective, I guess, period for me. I grew up between Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Both countries that I grew up in went through civil war in the 90s. And so I was exposed to a lot of, and again, this was before we really thought about, should 5-year-olds watch this kind of news? Should 7-year, there was no kind of censorship or ratings in that sense. People didn't really think in those ways. So from a very early age, I was very used to watching some pretty horrific news about killings and bombings and all the other things that is kind of included in civil war. And so I've been thinking a lot in terms of that, and in terms of how children today who are watching the news, how they're handling it. And again, I always come back to, I'm not saying children should be watching the news intentionally, but I try to alleviate parents' fears as much as I can, and say that children are very resilient, and that in the moment, things that are causing them stress, they're things that they can definitely overcome with your help as the parent, but not to worry too much in terms of, again, that long term effects, like, oh, has my child been ruined, or are they forever going to have issues now because they watched the show about maps all of this week. That's definitely not the case. That definitely won't happen. I think on a personal note, for me, one of the things that was very helpful growing up with the awareness of what was going on in these countries that I lived in was that news watching was always a communal activity. I never saw the news by myself, which is a little bit of a problem now with slightly older kids, right? If they own their own devices, they can go off into their rooms and then either fall down the YouTube rabbit hole or, whatever it is. But the coming together as a family or as a community to watch very difficult things in the news gave me a sense of safety that I feel kind of protected me from that initial just feeling of horror and terror and complete fear and complete insecurity. But the fact that I was there with a couple of generations of my family or family friends, or I wasn't watching it alone, and there were other people there who could kind of soothe me and who could talk to me and who could, obviously who shouldn't have let me watch the news to begin with, but like I said, it was the 90s people, so you'll have to forgive them for that. But that sense of community, I think, was very important. So that's something that that I would say to parents as well. It is a scary world, and it's a very strange world that we live in. But again, as long as your children don't feel alone in all of that, and as long as you talk to your children about that, and as long as we all kind of remind ourselves that this too shall pass, it's often not the best outcome. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that the result is going to be great, but it's that whole idea of impermanence, which I think anybody who's familiar with Eastern traditions, with mindfulness, with meditation, knows that that's a really big, it's a really big topic. It's this idea that we become very rigid and we kind of hook on to certain outcomes, and it becomes very difficult for us to let go. But for me, one of the things that I've personally found very helpful is to constantly remind myself of that there's constant flow and there's constant fluidity. And even in times when it seems incredibly scary and it seems like it's just never going to end, it is going to end, and something else will come after that. And it won't necessarily be better, but it will be different. And I think that's where then the idea of resilience comes in as well, and having a little bit of optimism. And which to me, optimism really isn't about the rose tinted glasses. It's about having a little bit of faith in your own resources and in your ability to kind of to help yourself in terms of that self-help, but also to really be able to reach out to your community, whatever that community is, however big or small, to seek that help. So parents, again, as much as they can, to come together as a community. I think that's one of the most wonderful ways for children to feel safe and to feel kind of cushioned and protected in those really scary moments, is when they know that there's that community of grown-ups around them who have some sense of stability and some sense of we'll figure it out one way or another. We'll figure it out, and we'll stay together. We're a tribal species. That's what gives us a sense of safety. We're not the lone wolves just kind of roaming around. We need that safety in numbers is really, really important. So that's another thing that I would say to parents, is to don't try not to do this alone. As much as you can, come in with others. If you need to schedule, watch the map show, but get on your friend with your friend on Zoom or something like that. Bring in more people, so that especially if your kids are around, they feel that sense of community. There's other people there.
Yeah, that is timely and almost poetic in a way. And I definitely relate to that. Being an 80s kid myself, and I want to propose one updated or a new term to next to doom scrolling that I think is a bit more descriptive, and it's disasterbation.
Oh God.
And
it is the most perfect thing I've heard all week.
Because I think doom scrolling is I think it just needs to expand, and maybe should
broaden.
be a two-tiered term.
That's perfect.
Yeah. I know, and I really appreciate the the taking in shocking
Mm,
news together,
mm, yeah.
especially because I remember, just being an 80s kid myself. There's so
Mm,
much more I want to get into, and I would like to put a bookmark in this
yes.
conversation, and really look forward, and hopefully you'll come back. And
I'd love to. Yeah,
great. Well, thank
definitely.
you so much for the time.
Of course.
And uh, what else can I say? I mean, I guess we'll all be talking and experiencing to collectively what's going to be happening in the coming days
Yeah.
and weeks. And I think there's also this sense that, people realize, like, this isn't going to end tomorrow.
No, exactly. That's the other thing.
It's
It's
going to,
that,
yeah.
yes, it's tolerance. It's building up
And
tolerance
resilience.
and
Absolutely.
resilience. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those are some of the most important things that we need, important skills that we need to develop. And I think we haven't done the best job of that. Technology partly has a role to play because it's so easy to escape the
Yeah.
discomfort. But it's incredibly important that we develop that muscle for tolerance of uncomfortable things, that we improve our resilience, our endurance, because again, especially for people who are parents, it helps your kids that much more when they can see that you can do it and you're modeling that kind of behavior for them. So again, it's just like you did right now, taking a deep breath and just kind of move through it moment by moment. And again, it will change. It will
Yeah.
change, and we'll figure out a way to cope with it. We're an incredibly resilient species. We wouldn't be here right now if we weren't. So we can handle it. It's
Absolutely.
that unknown that's incredibly scary.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hence the name wabi-sabi.
Yeah.
It's just about, it's just about spreading that around any way possible, sprinkling
Yeah.
it here and there.
Exactly.
So again, thank you so much for the time, and stay safe and stay healthy and stay
Yeah.
resilient. And we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. You too, Adam. Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you to all of our listeners who tuned in.
Yes. Oh, and please, and also send me some links that I can add to these show notes as well, please.
Sure.
Okay,
Sounds good.
great. All
Sounds
right.
good.
Take care.
Thanks, Adam.
Bye-bye.
Bye.